ongoing series that we're doing throughout this year with the Center for Politics, a partnership between the Center for Politics and the Batten School. In case you don't know, you're at the Batten School right now, and so we're grateful to our partners here for working with us throughout the course of this entire school year. And we've been addressing some really heavy problems, issues in American democracy. The series is called Democracy in Perilous Times. And we have been looking at issues of race in American society. Just last week we looked at the relationship of the media and the American public's consumption of media. We have addressed economic inequalities. So tonight, we thought, having addressed all of these heavy topics, that we'd do something nice and light and easy, right? And talk a little bit about religion and politics. The kind of thing that you talk about at the family dinner table, right? Just something very easy. Now, it's a complicated subject, to say the least. And so we are delighted to be joined by two really premier scholars in this field, and I'm delighted to introduce them to you now. Their resumes are extensive, so you'll pardon me if I'm going to just read a little bit of it. Melani McAlister is a professor of American Studies and International Affairs at George Washington University. Professor McAlister studied at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she received a BA in International Affairs, and then went to Brown University, where she earned a PhD in American Civilization. She has been a fellow at Princeton's Davis Center for Historical Studies, a faculty fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication, and a fellow at Princeton's Center for the Study of Religion. She has served on the International Advisory Board of the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University of Beirut, and as a member of the editorial boards of Modern American History, American Quarterly, the Journal of American History, and Diplomatic History. She has lectured at dozens of universities, both nationally and internationally, and she's also served as a consultant and lecturer for American Studies programs and institutes in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine. Professor McAlister has been the author of 3 books, over a dozen articles in academic journals and op-eds in many national newspapers, and her latest book, The Kingdom of God Has No Borders, a global history of American evangelicals. And it explores how U.S. evangelical Christians, white and black, have constructed their understandings and relationships with the people in the Middle East and Africa. Would you please welcome Professor Melani McAlister. Marie Griffith is the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professor in Humanities at Washington University in St. Louis, and the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Professor Griffith is a graduate of the University of Virginia, where she received a BA in political and social thought before moving on to her second choice school, also known as Harvard University, where she earned both her master's and her PhD in the study of religion. Professor Griffith served as a fellow, director, and professor at Princeton, a fellow at Northwestern University, and as the John A. Bartlett Professor at the Divinity School at Harvard. She specializes in 20th century American Christianity and its approach to women, gender, and sexuality. She is the author of 6 books and many articles in academic journals and elsewhere. And let me just tell you very quickly, at the risk of prolonging this impressive introduction, our guests tonight have worked together on a book called Religion and Politics in the Contemporary United States, and that's really what attracted our initial interest in reaching out to them and inviting them to be with us tonight. It's a collection of essays published as a special edition of American Quarterly, and their work explores the political activities of a diverse group of religious believers: Christians, Jewish believers, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others, and focusing on the meanings of religion for people who might even contest the term, those who are spiritual but not religious, for example, as well as activists who engage symbols of faith and community, but who may not necessarily consider themselves members of a specific religion. Several essays also examine the meaning of secular identity, humanist politics, and the complex evocations of civil religion in American life. You see, I told you this would be a nice, easy, light evening and topic for us to cover. So let me just open with a question to each of you. And Melanie, if you want to tackle it first. How does the image and use of faith or religion play into political image making today? And has religion always been a part of political imagery in the United States?
Yes, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, really. And I should say that I'm very upset with myself that I forgot to mark out the UNC part of my CV. But at least it's not Duke, right? I come from North Carolina, where basketball is a religion, so I keep up a little bit. So in terms of thinking about political image making, I think this is a really important question, because we know that in the US there's something like a civil religion that has been around for many, many decades, and maybe much longer, in which people seem to have to evoke the notion of belief in God as a kind of prerequisite to, say, running for national office. Or we know that, for example, the new US Congress has just one person who identifies as religiously unaffiliated, that the Congress is that the U.S. Congress is 88% Christian, 88% of the Congress identifies as Christian, and 71% of the U.S. public. So there is some sense that not only religion in general, but maybe specific religions are mobilized as authenticating language, authenticating values for people who want to make political claims. And that's one of the things that people are often concerned about when they talk about the intersection of religion and politics. Are you required in a country that is not supposed to have a religious test for office, or it is supposed to have a reasonable separation between religion and the state? Is there in fact some de facto requirement that people should have a certain religion, or at least some religion, in order to be able to make political claims? And that seems to have been the case for a very long time. And I'll just give one other quick example of that, which we saw with President Obama. So President Obama was and is a Christian, but the fact that people used the claim that he was a Muslim to try to make an argument that he was illegitimate, that he couldn't be trusted to have the highest office in the land, that he was not only a stealth Muslim, but that being a Muslim in of itself was a kind of disqualification for office, was one of the more disturbing things that I've seen in my adult political life. And when President Obama was still candidate and he was running and people were already making this claim, it fell to Colin Powell to say, if he were a Muslim, that would be okay. He could still be president. Like, we allow that, and he's still a good guy. The fact that even Obama himself found it difficult to say that during his campaign is a sign, I think, of the ways in which quietly, religious test for office still seems to be an issue in our country.
You want me to speak to this too? Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that, but, and let me just start by saying thank you as well to you for inviting me, and it is a joy always to come back to my alma mater, Wahoo Wah. You know, I think Melanie's touched on it really well, the kinds of, you know, I think ambivalence, the sorts of contradictions that there are when it comes to the ways, what we expect in our leaders, or what we imagine their faith to be. You know, the other example here is Hillary Clinton, who is a, you know, card-carrying Methodist from way back when, who would always say that her religious background is what propelled her into this. Her parents took her to, or her youth minister took her to see Martin Luther King Jr. when she was a teenager in the youth group at her church, and that it propelled her into a very, you know, I don't know if you'd call it progressive, but, you know, a more liberal sense of, you know, policy making that really stemmed from her views of what Jesus calls Christians to do in the world. And, you know, and yet her faith as well wasn't taken seriously, you know, by an awful lot of people. Christianity itself has sort of come to be narrowly equated, you know, with a very conservative, you know, if not quite religious right, but, you know, a very sort of conservative vision. And that interpretation of Christianity is alive and well, of course. But Christianity is a rich tradition with a lot of different modes of interpretation, as all religions are. And so, you know, you see some of those there too. So people kind of watch political candidates, and I think, you know, oftentimes, intentionally or not, or consciously or not, they want their own religious views reflected in what they see there. And, you know, we know that there's an awful lot of lip service paid to religion in politics. And it's hard to separate the wheat from the chaff in those cases.
Well, the protection of religion obviously has figured prominently in the statecraft of this nation. How closely do you think we have adhered to what the founders imagined in inserting that religious protection within the Constitution? Do you think we've strayed from it? Have we adhered to it? Has it become, would they recognize its operation today, do you think?
Well, of course, our founders could not have anticipated a lot of the religious conflicts that have come up in recent years. So whether they possibly, I don't think people could possibly have anticipated the multiplicity of religion and, you know, the many different types of conflict that have, you know, come out of religious faith. You know, it's very difficult. One thing that makes the United States, you know, somewhat unique is the emphasis we place on religious freedom, religious liberty, on free exercise, you know, also, you know, no establishment, all of these things, and the combination of them, which is often explosive, you know, make this country somewhat unique. And it's been very, very complicated. I'm not a legal expert, but, you know, we've just had court cases and court decisions over the years that if you look at them in tandem, you see patterns, but you also see real divergences and contradictions. And, you know, a lot of human bias in what counts as religion and what protections are owed to different religious groups. And, you know, it's a pretty bewildering landscape, I think. I mean, don't you think that's true?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think I would agree with that, and I would say that one of the things when we talk about disestablishment and the vision of what religion might mean in American democracy is that I like to think of it as being about both freedom of religion and freedom from religion. That's what those two components of the protections around the First Amendment mean. That is that Americans have the right to practice their religion and to be protected from discrimination because of that practice, but they also have the right to be free from state injunction about what religion they should practice or requirements for what religion they should practice. And that, both of those things are central. And the balance between them and how to protect both the practice of religion and protect people from religious coercion is really, a central part of how people have tried to work it out. And I think that what Marie is pointing out is that part of that has been a long-standing set of conversations about, well, what even constitutes religion? How do we know that people can be, that a certain behavior is protected as religious or not religious? And my favorite, most recent one is because I've been doing yoga for a long time in my life, and so I pay a little attention to that. And there was a court case a couple of years ago in California about whether California could teach yoga in the public schools. And the question of whether you can teach yoga in the public schools is entirely dependent on whether or not yoga is a religion. So having practiced yoga literally for 30 years, I have no idea. So I was really interested to see what the state of California would tell me about this particular question. And the state of California, in their wisdom, said, no, it is not a religion. Why is it not a religion? Because it does not have a clear set of requirements of what people need to believe in their hearts in order to adhere to it. It is simply a set of practices or behaviors. Now, poor religion scholars, we've spent 30 years talking about religion as a set of practices and behaviors and not necessarily defined by just what you believe. But that notion that religion can be defined only by what you say you believe, what you hold as policy statements of your heart, so to speak, is very hardwired into a lot of discussion about the state and religion in the US. And in this case, it sort of allowed for some nice yoga practice in the California public schools, but it didn't really, it spoke again to the complexity and the continuing contradictions of these court cases.
I just want to turn back to your introduction and something I mentioned, and specifically the book that you wrote together, Religion and Politics in the Contemporary United States. And I noted that you mentioned that there were, people sometimes who might contest this term of religion or having the term sort of applied to them. And then those activists who engage symbols of faith and community, but who may not necessarily consider themselves members of a specific religion. Can you help us sort of unpack some of the examples you might have encountered in studying that? Are there one or two that come to mind? I'm just springing this question on you, but I'm just struck by, I think the audience might even appreciate. What are some examples of that?
Well, one of the classic cases was, can Native Americans use peyote as part of a religious ritual, right? And, so the debate there, kind of has to do with, is this a religious practice? Well, what does that mean? Native American religion or spirituality looks very different from, Methodist Christianity. And, just as an example of how, jurists and legal thinkers and maybe religion scholars have to think about, okay, well, if we're going to bound it this way, or if we're going to be inclusive or exclusive, you have to justify that in some way. And as Melani says, I am a scholar of religion. My PhD's in religion, and I will tell all of you, religious studies scholars stumble on this all the time. Scientology is an example my students often give me, because we try to talk about people's stereotypes of cults. Is there really such a thing as a cult? If so, what do you think of as a cult? And students will often, these days, say Scientology. So we try to talk about that. And then the example that you've just given of yoga and other therapeutic practices. I mean, when is something a psychological therapeutic practice or a medical, regimen, and when is it a religion? So there's a lot of dilemmas, I think, that the courts really face, and I think try to face these questions with tremendous thoughtfulness, but it is very difficult what you say defines
Is a cult different than a religion? Have you found variations of?
A cult is a religion without the patina of old age.
Okay.
A cult is a religion other people don't like, right? I mean, I don't mean to be facetious, but it is kind of it tends to be a term used by outsiders, of course, on the inside. And, it tends, it's obviously a very negative kind of term, and it does kind of fall apart, once you look too deeply into it, I think.
I mean, what people mean when they talk about cult is the notion that they often mean to imply that the people who are in it don't have free will or don't have choice or have been, we were talking about brainwashing earlier today, about have been brainwashed into a certain set of beliefs. But many people outside of many religions will talk about people in that religion as if, obviously how could you believe that unless you'd been taught that from an early age and didn't know how to think any differently. So I don't think most scholars of religion would make a big distinction there.
I think politically, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes that label, cult, gets misapplied to more traditional religions. I remember, for example, Mitt Romney and Mormonism and his campaign for the presidency. That was many times disparagingly labeled as a cult for political gain in some cases.
Right. A lot of Protestants used to very much see, the LDS Church, Mormonism, whatever you want to call it, as a cult. Alongside Jehovah's Witnesses were often an example that was used, and, some others. And, again, there was this imagining that people were almost compelled to be within that community, that certain rules were so heavily enforced and people were so isolated from other things that they couldn't think for themselves or imagine another life. So you're absolutely right. Romney got a lot of that. In 2004, a lot less of it actually, a lot less of it the second time around. I'm forgetting which years those
12.
were. 12, okay, 8 to 12. So, it's really interesting. Some of that had dissipated by then, partly because Mormons and evangelicals have allied politically quite well in many cases around issues of gender and sexuality, where there's a lot of agreement and overlap, on the conservative side. But I digress.
I recall at the time, thinking back on 2012, and we were, Larry Sabato and I were doing this joint seminar about President Kennedy and his 1960 campaign, and students would often express in one form or another that, well, thank goodness we've moved beyond that. That, the way that John Kennedy sort of faced the Catholic issue in 1960, that we had moved beyond that as a country. And then they were kind of surprised to see it reappear in a different form in 2012. Do you think that's just inevitable when people don't understand these types of things, or why does it continue to happen?
Well, I would say that it didn't, it had already appeared about Islam in 2008. Right? So it's really that they were surprised it had happened to a group that they considered Christian, right?
Well, it's a good point.
Yeah. But I do think that the fact is that the evangelicals and some leaders in LDS did have a meeting. There was a meeting, and they did talk about coming out of that meeting, the evangelical leaders coming out of that meeting and feeling like, oh, we see they really are Christian, and they really are Christian in ways that are a lot like we're Christian. And so, they really backed off of a lot of the sentiment that had been remarkably similar to what we saw in the 60 campaign, with Kennedy. And I was actually reading some of Christianity Today's coverage of the Kennedy election because I was just reading from that period. And I was really surprised at I don't know how to put this, but actually the seemingly genuine anxiety that people felt about the Pope. Looking back, it seems like I sort of somehow wanted to think that they were pretending that they were afraid because they didn't like Catholics, but I think that their anti-Catholicism was so profound that it actually did lead to a sense that, oh, he really might not be true to America. He might be taking orders from the Pope if he's a good Catholic. And that sense of the way in which that anxiety seemed to permeate. And I think we saw that with LDS, and we see it with other groups as well. And
just so you're differentiating, though, that versus what occurred with President Obama, right? There's a difference in terms of one looks.
I meant that actually I imagined that when people were saying these things about Kennedy back in 1960, I didn't realize it seemed to me that there was just some people trying to protect Protestant hegemony and didn't want a Catholic elected, but I didn't realize how fearful it was. You got the sense of the fearfulness about Catholicism. And then that changes over time as Catholics are mainstreamed more into American political life. But at the time, that sense of fear was real. I think that the same thing that when people were talking about Obama and seemed to genuinely believe, a bunch of people seemed to genuinely believe that he was a Muslim and seemed to be genuinely fearful about what that might mean. It's an index of how bad the sentiment is, how intense the sentiment, the anti-Catholic or later the anti-Muslim sentiment is all I was saying.
But can I just jump in here? Because, one thing about that, though, I mean, the reason so many Protestant Americans were afraid of the church hierarchy had interfered, in a lot of social movements in ways that were sort of behind the scenes. So take Margaret Sanger and the birth control movement or something, and other, kind of feminist activists around some of these issues. I mean, the hierarchy, the Archbishop of New York was very much, kind of pushing against that and sort of trying to force her off stage in some cases and not to. So there were concrete empirical cases where people feared what the hierarchy might actually do. And, is Kennedy, a tool of that? I agree the anxiety was so high. And maybe the anxiety was directed in the wrong place. But, there was that kind of political activism in the Catholic Church, and some of that, has emerged in other contexts at a later point. But.
Well, I wonder if you might just expand on that a little bit and talk about when and how is religious activism shaped by other forms of identity and political values, such as race and gender. It's a nice broad question.
Yeah. You can't separate these things, can you? I mean, I don't, see, none of us imagine our identities as sort of divided, across these things. We have life experience that, is shaped by all of these kinds of forms of identity and how people on the outside look at us and respond to us, from a very young age. So, I think it's very, very difficult to separate those things out on the racial side or gender. I do think that, people's experiences of, growing up in a specific religious community as a woman or a man profoundly shapes your sense of what that tradition is. I mean, there's been a lot of feminists pushing against, a lot of religious traditions over a long period of time because women have felt like second-class citizens, in a lot of the churches. And so that, and that can often lead to other forms of activism in the public square, right, in all sorts of ways. And I think you could say the very same thing about African-American Christians being so profoundly shaped by the history of race and slavery and Jim Crow segregation in this country. And, the churches and religious communities have been places where people have often, bound together. And their religious sense of justice has really propelled them into political activism in a whole diversity of ways.
Yeah. I would like to give two different examples of that. I think that might be of interest. Now, I'm looking at the audience to try to see how old people are, because I want to know who knows that there was a Nigerian civil war in the late 1960s and the starving children of Biafra. You might remember or have read about in the Nigerian Civil War, there was a blockade against the Eastern Path, and the images of children with big bellies that are, when they're starving, comes out of that war. That's a particular kind of starvation, and it was on the cover of Life and on the cover of Time. And in the US, as well as in Europe, there was a lot of activism on the behalf of the Biafrans. And this activism was by religious groups, lots of churches and synagogues having candlelight vigils. It was also by secular groups who were organized in local communities. It was by a very small but Nigerian community in the US, and it was by a lot of white people and some African Americans, a wide variety of people. But I've done some research on American Jewish Committee's involvement on Biafra, and they amuse me because the guy who runs this committee in the late 1960s, I think is very cool. His name is Mark Tannenbaum, and he's head of the interreligious coalition that has American Jewish Committee interacting with evangelicals and Catholics and others. And so he's the person who's in charge of interreligious dialogue. And he's also the person in charge of their Biafra work. And they did a lot of Biafra work. People were, and it was funny, young people would have like their bar mitzvah money come in and they would say, I don't know who's helping the starving Biafrans, but I'm just going to send it to American Jewish Committee. They'll know what to do with it. And it turned out they did. They were part of something called Joint Church Aid that was helping the Biafrans. And Tenenbaum used to say, and he's clearly poking at missionary work among Christians, Catholics and Protestants that he works with pretty closely, he'd say, yep, we're sending money to Biafra. They are not Jews. They are unlikely to become Jews. That's okay with us. We're going to send them money anyway. And it was like, I just thought, yeah, so he is saying that as a Jew, he felt, and he was speaking for his community, that they had a responsibility to, heal the world, to respond to social injustice and to what they saw as a major global crisis, aside from any kind of missionary connection. So is that his religion speaking? Absolutely. But is it speaking, as he's trying to argue, in a very specific way that also is connected to a Jewish identity that might not be per se religious, that might be true for people who may not be practicing Jews, but might see themselves as having a Jewish identity that is both religious and ethnic, or maybe just ethnic, but who could sign on to that kind of language. So that's one way you can see religion and ethnicity, race in a complicated, mushy fashion. And the other example I'm just going to use is something I wrote for Marie's journal, Religion and Politics, and that I wrote this past summer about evangelicals in the Trump era. And I did some interviews with different evangelicals of color in the Trump era, let me be clear. So I did some interviews with Asian American, African American, and Latino evangelicals to talk about what it meant to be evangelical and to identify as evangelical in the Trump era. And the title of the article comes from one of the interviews with an Asian American woman who's head of a group called Evangelicals for Social Action, in which she described her experience as a kind of homelessness. And this was something that all of them spoke about. Like, I'm an evangelical. This is my religious identity. She'd been involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and all these evangelical organizations since she was in college. And she said, for a long time, she'd been talking to white evangelicals about like race, and she felt like people were making progress, and the African-American guy said the same thing. We're all like talking about, overcoming racism and multiracial churches and all of this stuff. And then she's a very quotable person. She said, and then you're sitting there the day after the election in church, and 3 or 4 days after the election in church, and sitting next to the wonderful white person next to you, and you're saying, so, that racism thing, it just wasn't a deal breaker for you, huh? And that for her, that sense that she had and that I had 5 years ago, that evangelicalism was a multiracial movement that was becoming more and more led by people of color in the United States, that story might be ending because the sense of the racial divide in evangelicalism being so strong.
Yeah, and what do you think has caused that? Or what is creating that shift?
Well, I'll say this and then kind of hand it to Marie. I think abortion.
Abortion?
I think there are many issues. Immigration could be one, but I think the fact is that a lot of evangelicals who might have voted a variety of different ways, white evangelicals, ended up not voting for Trump or not voting for Clinton because they took abortion to be the primary issue. And many people of color felt that immigration or racism, Black Lives Matter, those kinds of things should be as important, even if they are against abortion, which many evangelicals of color are, but felt that the other issues should be equally central and that white evangelicals tended to see it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think abortion was very, very important in the last election. It's become increasingly important. And, a couple of points to make about that. In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was decided, the vast majority of Americans across religions, including Catholics, were in favor of some degree of abortion reform. They did not want abortion to be illegal in all cases. After Roe v. Wade came down and sort of just lifted the lid off of all of it, Protestants gradually changed their position. So in 1973, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention praised Roe v. Wade and said an abortion is an issue between a woman and her doctor, or a woman's choice. So these very religious, what we would look at now as evangelicals, were in favor of abortion reform. Something dramatically changed by the early to mid 80s. So that issue became, in many cases, I would say, weaponized by political interests in a way that's been profoundly successful. So that has made a big difference in the kinds of shaping of the Republican Party and the kinds of reasons why white evangelicals are so tied to particular conservative politics, which at one point they were not. The other thing, though, I would say in a different vein that some evangelical leaders have helped me understand too is I do think there has been this sense, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, among many white evangelicals that they've been laughed at by the cultural elite, right? By the intellectual elite, that they've been humiliated in some way by liberals, and we could talk about that all night. What are the reasons for that? Who are the talk radio folks who are sort of, I think, drilling that into their heads over and over again so they imagine this sense of humiliation. But regardless of where it comes from, I do think that that has been a profoundly motivating factor on that side. And seeing in someone like Donald Trump, someone who was on their side, someone who would fight back against the same things they wanted to fight back about, was profoundly, I think, meaningful for a lot of people. So there's not a single reason, I don't think, this kind of why did evangelicals support Trump, but I do think these two, the abortion and the kind of sense of cultural alienation or sense of humiliation, are two major factors for sure.
Do you think there's been any waning of I'm thinking specifically of what the quote-unquote religious right was in the late 80s and throughout the 1990s, and the moral majority and the Christian coalition. And there was a time period then, early 2000s, when it seemed they had gone quiet, or they were quieter than they had been in the 80s and 90s. But Melani, it seems like and maybe you touch on it with your book. What is the variation of evangelical political engagement today? And is it the same group, different, some modification?
Yeah, this is a good question because, of course, we see generations shifting too, and no group has more evangelicals have profound differences in generations around political positions, American evangelicals. And I will say that one of the points of my book is I keep trying to talk in the book about evangelicals as a multiracial group in the United States. Today, depending on who's doing the polling and how you ask and how you define evangelical and all those things, today between 25 to 35% of evangelicals in the U.S. are people of color. Latinos are a large portion of that, and again, it depends on how African Americans are counted. African Americans tend not to identify as evangelical. They tend not to like that label because they see it as a white conservative label, but the same theological terms that people use to define white evangelicals often apply to many African American churches as well. So that is one of the questions, and of course Asian Americans and Arabs and others who are within the evangelical camp, either in separate churches or in these big multiracial mega churches. So when we talk about evangelicals in the US, we're not just talking about white people. And that in itself means we're not talking about the same people, because the rise of Latino population in the US, the increasing diversity of the American population, the number of people coming from Asia, or who are second or third generation who are in evangelical churches is high, and Latinos and African Americans and Africans. So no, we're not talking about the same people who are evangelicals. Now, the religious right, I think, is also complicated because often what people look for when they think about whether people are on the religious right or not is how they stand on abortion, how they stand on lesbian and gay issues, They don't often ask as many questions as they could about, for example, how do people feel about aid to Africa? Or how do they feel about funding for HIV/AIDS, or those kinds of things, which might be considered more progressive and which evangelicals tend to be more supportive of across the board than they have more progressive positions there than they do around abortion, for sure. Lesbian and gay issues, younger evangelicals are far more liberal than middle-aged evangelicals, who are more liberal than older. Abortion, people tend to be pretty conservative across the board, across generations. So I would say that what we saw after 2000 is a change in some of the language, animating language for evangelicals. And this comes to what Marie was saying, and I'm going to just put it in slightly different language, which is that the notion that Christians are persecuted has been one of the most animating forces in Christian life, not just for evangelicals, but I wrote a book about evangelicals, so I'll talk about them, for evangelicals in the last 40 years or more. Now, people talked about Christians as persecuted by communists all throughout the Cold War. This was a major issue. I tell a story about a guy standing up on the Senate floor in 1967, taking off his shirt, 1966, taking off his shirt and showing his scarred back. He was a minister from Romania, a converted Jew who'd become a Christian and who'd been tortured in Romania. And he takes off his shirt in the Senate floor, which was quite racy in 1966, and says, "This is my body, I have been tortured for Christ." And that becomes the title of his best-selling book. That's not new, but what becomes new and what gets animated is with the end of the Cold War, people begin talking about Christians as persecuted not by communism, but by Muslims. And there is a clear move to talk more and more after 1989 about the dangers to Christians as coming from the Muslim world. Now, there is real persecution of Christians in some parts of the Muslim world. That's not, stuff that's totally made up at all, but this focus, a kind of mapping of the world, some parts of the world in red, moves from mapping the communist world to mapping the Muslim world, and the people being endangered are increasingly talked about as Christians persecuted by Muslims. This sense of Christians as persecuted globally around the world has been important to Americans as they've started paying more attention to global Christianity. So American Christians have increasingly come to understand what scholars have been saying for some time, which is that Christianity is a religion now based in the global South. There's no question about that. More than 50% of Christians in the world live outside the US and Europe, and that number is rising rapidly. It should be about 70% of evangelicals, in particular evangelicals and Pentecostals, live outside the US and Europe. When I started working on my book 15 years ago, I saw some white guy at a conference, and I was like, "Why are you here? Why are you so interested in international issues?" And he said, "I have to be interested in international issues. I'm part of a third world religion." So that sense of being connected to the global South, which I consider an exemplary good thing in many ways, has led people to also see themselves as being part of a group that is persecuted by Muslims. As they get more news about what's happening to Christians in the global South and identify more fully with that, they understand more about that, but they also see it in sometimes very simplistic terms, so conflicts that might be fueled by ethnicity, by money, by access to resources, by all sorts of things are often painted in the US media as being Christian and Muslim conflicts. And that's the only thing that I can then use to explain the following statistic, which is that in 2017, a poll asked American evangelicals if they believed that Christians were discriminated against in the United States, and 55% said yes. And then they said, "Do you believe that Muslims are discriminated against in the United States?" And 44% said yes. So if evangelicals believe that Christians in the US face more discrimination than Muslims, the only way I can explain that is by understanding this connection to some sense of global persecution. And so the sense of being a persecuted minority has enabled a kind of victim politics among American evangelicals, and particularly white evangelicals, that at first glance might seem surprising.
Well, that is a crucial story. I absolutely agree. And Melani tells it beautifully in her book, I want to say. But I think American white evangelicals have felt persecuted from other forces that are more domestic. And I know this because this is in all the kind, all these books and everything. They felt persecuted by feminists, by liberals, by secular humanists, and they've sort of pitched this over and over again, that those folks are sort of taking over your culture. They're taking over our culture from us. They are imposing, a liberal worldview. They're imposing sexual promiscuity and homosexuality. And that too, and I don't mean instead of, but in addition to what you're saying, that sense of being persecuted has been very much a domestic one, and a sense that Christians in particular are being persecuted for their values, and that a country that was once a Christian nation and once their nation in many ways is being taken over by this kind of decadent, selfish, narcissistic kind of model of what it means to be a person, and they want to take your children too. So there's often been, these fears stoked, whether it's about gay men and women or, lots of different things, sex education in the public schools. This fear has been that the children are getting taken away. People are, Anita Bryant, Phyllis Schlafly, these sort of major Christian conservative leaders gave that message over and over again, as did Jerry Falwell and many of the leaders still today. So that sense of persecution, I think, comes from different directions and is directed toward, maybe different populations. And I don't mean instead of, but sort of in different ways, but at the same time.
Well, it's interesting. There is this still pervasive notion, and I say this as my father is a Baptist minister, right? So it's coming from personal experience. I know that there is this a pervasive notion and use of the phrase of Christian nation, that it was founded on the principles of Christianity. And I always push back against that. What are your thoughts? Is it a Christian nation? Was it and how does that rhyme with the First Amendment?
It's not there's no simple answer to this, but basically there are reasons why you could argue that, the founding fathers, took Christian ideas for granted as just sort of obvious for them. They knew Islam existed, they knew other religions existed. Thomas Jefferson was one of the most curious and read deeply across sort of, world religions. And we know that from his library and his writings and all sorts of things. But in general, he too, would have taken very much Christianity as being obviously the true religion. So there is a certain way that you can read Christian concepts baked into our founding documents from the very beginning. That's absolutely true. At the same time, there were Jews here from very, very early on. There were Muslims here. A lot of slaves who were brought over from Africa were actually Muslim, and many of them were forced to convert, but some of them held on to that Islam. And of course, we know waves of immigration brought Catholics and eventually would bring Hindus and more Muslims from different parts of the world and all different religions. And because of these constitutional First Amendment principles that Melanie and I were talking about earlier, there is a very important foundational idea that we are going to, allow everyone to worship as they deeply and sincerely believe that they ought. And so, you've really you could argue this from different angles, from different sides, and that's why, if you want to make a fortune, write a book on the founding fathers and religion, or founding fathers generally. That stuff sells like hotcakes. But I think a lot of people genuinely want to know, is it a Christian nation or not? And there are literatures out there to support both sides. But it's clear that these kind of notions of no establishment, means that even if their assumptions were deeply Christian, baked into those founding documents, we have always been a nation that was attempting to be pluralistic.
And, well, it's similarly around that, and based on, you've done a lot of work of political organization and political activity with religion as a component of it. And we hear so much about this organization of Christians. Why is it the case that other religious affiliations have not been recruited by either the left or the right, or there aren't sufficient numbers to have the impact that you see when you're organizing Christians? Is it possible to have this organization among other religions for political purposes along the lines of what we've seen for Christians and especially conservative Christians?
I think Malcolm X is turning over in his grave right now. I mean, we have seen, right, that people have organized on other lines other than Christianity for political affiliation and have spoken from their religious perspectives about what kind of country this should be. I mentioned Malcolm X because the Nation of Islam was an important political force in the 1960s and into the 1970s, and provided a vision that both challenged and complemented the kind of political vision that Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and other civil rights leaders were providing about how religion might speak about what kind of world or what kind of country African Americans wanted. And so we've seen that. I mentioned the example of American Jews working on Biafra, and of course American Jews have also been active on issues around Israel and other kinds of foreign policy issues. They were also active, as were Christians and a bunch of other people around apartheid, and did so in this way that this is one of the things Marie and I were having coffee earlier, and we were talking about, you know, as people who write and think a lot about religion, it's so hard nonetheless to talk about when people are talking from their religion and when they're talking from something that is a mush of many other things that shape us. But anti-apartheid activism, which was built in all sorts of ways in synagogues and the Episcopal Church and all sorts of African-American churches and others, Trans-Africa, which was founded as an organization to focus on African-American activism around to end apartheid, also focused on getting African-American churches involved. And they didn't say when they went to the churches, like, bring your religion but not your racial politics. I mean, they wanted both. They assumed that both of those things were highly relevant to getting people to oppose apartheid. So I think that we would say that all sorts of people have spoken from their faith commitments about what kind of world they want. And that's really more what I see than, you know, who's able to organize Jews and Hindus and others, as a political force, because that kind of implies that they are there to be organized. But I think it's more about self-organizing. You know, when can people put their sense of what their religious faith or their non-religious set of values are toward their political activism.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, that's an interesting observation, because I could have it just completely wrong, but I think people like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell had a very different view of that, right? They were people to be recruited, to be organized. And is it just because there is no figure on the left to do that sort of thing, or is it a different sort of, they cannot be motivated in that way?
So, you know, I guess the thing to say about this is that, you know, we're kind of talking about different types of political activism.
yeah.
And I think, you know, what I think of when I think of Pat Robertson or some of the mobilization of the religious right really is the kind of, you know, I used the word weaponization earlier, and I mean that seriously, of kind of particular fears about sexuality and gender issues. You know, I wrote a book last year called Moral Combat: How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics. And this is sort of the theme of that. You can go back actually to the birth control movement of the 1920s, through everything from sex education, abortion politics, even sexual harassment, as we've seen, and LGBT issues and others, and watch a kind of movement build, you know, that really weaponizes fear more than anything. So, you know, we can talk about those kinds of issues that we typically call the culture war issues. Or there are these other types of issues that are profoundly meaningful, like Melanie, you're pointing to, for people, and they are still giving money and acting out and voting, based, on deeply religious principles. Jewish support for Israel, in some quarters also, profoundly, meaningful. So there's all different sorts of, ways that you could see different types of political action, I think, being inspired by that. But the ways that leaders motivate folks, differ dramatically, as you're pointing out.
I want to leave plenty of time for audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone around to you.
Hi, my name is Zoe. Thank you guys for coming to speak.
Would you mind standing up?
Very enriching, yes, yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So I have a question, and I don't want it to sound like too confusing, or I think it sounds a little bit confusing in my head, so I'll try to just explain what my question is slowly. But especially with social issues, so abortion, just because with the recent New York legislation that was passed, abortion's a hot topic issue for the last few weeks, but it has been for many years. Would you say that a lot of very religious individuals who are involved in politics, or who identify very closely with the religion, do you think when they're approaching these types of social issues gay marriage or abortion, do you think they're making legislative decisions, or their thought process is more related to their idea that both church and state should be sort of merged into one? Or do you just think that their worldview is so completely different that when they try to justify certain pieces of legislation that have to do with social issues, they don't see it as that merge between church and state? It's just common sense to them.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think your question gets at an important issue, which is also, we've already talked about how religion is so difficult to define. Where does morality come from? Our basic moral views religious? I think that those folks, I don't think they're trying to get rid of the separation between church and state. I just think they see, if you believe that an egg and a sperm at conception is as fully sanctified and a full human being as much as any one of us in this room, and you believe that to, intentionally quaff that is murder, you're going to believe that's true for everyone. You're not going to say, but that's just my faith position. I mean, this is what's difficult, I think about, the two sides and why they often, aren't able to communicate. Because these are moral views. These are, views that people hold deeply, and they don't see them as something, they don't see those as church-state issues in the same way. At least, if you're on the pro-life side, I think profoundly. People on the pro-choice side often do see these as, the kind of, that is you imposing your religion on me. And I don't believe in your religion. I don't want your religion. I do not believe, that is murder. At least to whatever point, people differ on that. But that's what's really complicated, again, is trying to, it's just become, as you know, just an impossible to have the conversation around that.
Yeah, I just agree completely with that. It's just a very difficult conversation to have, because the line between, it's a conversation we have to have, but the line between saying, this is something I believe for whatever reason, and therefore I believe it to be a moral position that our country should stand up for. I believe that lesbian and gay people should be able to marry. Whatever reason I believe that, religious, non-religious, that's something I believe. I believe it should be the law of the land. Now, am I imposing my faith on someone? Or am I saying this is what I believe, and therefore I'm trying to generalize that, what I think is a moral position? And so that's the problem, that people say they believe it for whatever reason they do, but we're all in a process of trying to, in some sense, things that we believe are are not quite negotiable. You can't say, well, you could, I guess, but you can't, it's not like, well, some states should allow people to marry and some shouldn't, or some people should get to marry and others shouldn't. You know, it's a position that has to be generalized to be enforceable or real.
I mean, here's another example. You know, many white Christians in the 19th century and into the 20th century profoundly believed that black people were inferior to white, right? And I think they just took this as a given. This was the way God made the world. There's all kinds of pro-slavery and pro-segregation theology out there from ministers and, you know, Christian thinkers and all of that. So, you know, if they want to legislate that, or when Brown versus Board of Education comes in and says you can't do that, are they infringing on their religion, you know? Well, the courts decided no. I mean, you know, you can think what you want, but segregation is wrong. Civil rights trump whatever you think your religious worldview is. But these other issues, you know, tend to, they're still really fuzzy in these areas. And, you know, so I think that's a reason why it's just so complex. So
there's probably an undercurrent of that even today when we're talking about immigration and building a wall. There is this element that, as far as people sometimes argue that this country has come over 400 years, in many ways, we're still there. Right? We're still at these same places, still battling these same wars that, you know, it's just a different race, it's a different color of people, it's a different focus, but there's this veiled argument that these people are inferior to us white Christians.
yeah, sometimes not so veiled.
I was about to say,
Yeah, well,
I spend way too much time on Twitter to think it's veiled, but yeah.
Yeah, good point. Next question. Whoever has the microphone.
So firstly, thank you both again for coming and speaking to us on this, which is, again, as you pointed out in the 2016 election, such a critical issue. There were a couple of themes that you seem to go back to over and over. The first was the First Amendment being both a freedom of religion and a freedom from religion. And then you also touched on the idea of Christians feeling persecuted, specifically the white evangelical groups. I'm curious where those two sort of blend together. We mentioned the idea of the Kennedy election and then how Romney was treated. But I also can think of just in the last 2 to 3 years, at least 3 different instances in the Senate where people's religious affiliations have come up despite the fact that they're not necessarily the most relevant. And where people have been directly told because of their very publicly held religious beliefs, even if they have had no impact on the rest of their career, has made them almost ineligible. And these have been statements made not just by one senator, by 4 individual senators that I can think of. And I'm curious whether or not those, you know, how those play a role in the belief of persecution for Christian groups, especially when they see this sort of coming almost uniformly from the left, and similar tests are not necessarily applied across the board. And so I'm just curious how that plays a role, especially because several of these were highly publicized.
That's a great question, and I think the answer is, well, there are probably a number of answers, but one thing I would say is that people's commitment to religious freedom seems to me to be sometimes intermittent.
Well put.
And that commitment can be spoken so eloquently when we're talking about the right to choose who you make a cake for, and then seem to kind of go underground when you're talking about recognizing and supporting the right of people to represent their politics and their faith and their views in the highest offices of the land, or even the lowest ones. And so I think that one of the things is that I sound like kind of traditionalist when I say this, but I think that training in religious freedom is a very important thing for us to do, and to train in what that means. And it used to be, Southern Baptist actually used to be pretty good at this, and then they got pretty bad at it. But the notion of that religious freedom means actually saying that even when I don't like it, maybe I would like to have the 10 Commandments up in the courthouse, but recognizing that in fact those kind of displays might be seen as, by other people who have equal right to their own self-expression and religious identity might be seen as an imposition of religious ideas is something that I think people have, we are not very good at anymore, or ever maybe, but not, it seemed to me that the discourse around religious freedom has become so partisan that people are quite willing, almost overtly, to say religious freedom for us. And so that, President Trump could say that we're going to, limit the so-called Muslim ban, we're going to limit immigration from these Muslim majority countries except for Christians. And he could do that based on this notion of Christian persecution, but really it was somehow unclear to him and the people who tended to support that this was religious discrimination. And so I think that coming back to these kind of really basic lessons about what it means to support religious freedom seems to me to be a crucial part of what kind of our public life needs to be right now.
It's my kind of not completely certain understanding, but that church attendance and maybe synagogue and mosque attendance has kind of been on the decline recently in the United States. Could you talk about kind of how that impacts the role of religion and politics, especially kind of from the lens of religious institutions as kind of like a part of civil society in a politically organizing way?
Yeah, sure. And to just a disclaimer that neither of us we're not pollsters or, sociologists, so I'm interpreting data from others. This is not, my own data by any means, but, a lot of things have shifted in recent years, and you're correct. One of the, often noted new kind of demographics, I guess, is more and more Americans, when asked about their religion, are saying that they're nones, N-O-N-E-S, right? In other words, that they're agnostic or atheist or just indifferent, to religion, not participating. And what we don't know, and no one knows this, is whether those numbers have actually risen or whether more people are now comfortable coming out as someone who's really kind of secular, someone who might have used to have said they were Christian or Jew or whatever, and now will say that nothing. But we do know, I think you're correct, that church attendance in many areas is down. Church attendance in the progressive, more liberal Protestant denominations has been going down for some time. The mainline, so, there are a lot of Episcopal, United Methodist, Presbyterian churches that were once thriving, got 1,000 people there on Sunday morning, and are now quite tiny and quite elderly. And so, younger people seem not to be rejoining the church in those ways. Conservative congregations have stayed, more robust in many settings, but they too have had some declining numbers. I think it's a very important question what that does to civil society, because, whether it's a religious organization or not, having institutions that bring people together, and hopefully people that aren't exactly like-minded on every issue, I think is really important to democracy and to our civil society. And if all of us are sitting around on Twitter, which I do, but if we're isolating ourselves and doing a lot less of that, social scientists like Robert Putnam and others have really told us how dangerous this is for our society. Rates of volunteerism are down, all kinds of things are really down. So I sort of see, one way to think about this is that these religious institutions, their sort of decline is part of a larger sort of decline in some of these other civic institutions, and that is a perilous. I know your topic is perilous times. I think that is a sort of perilous trajectory in many ways. So that's how I would think about your question, and I appreciate it.
Can I just jump in here? Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to say that I think I see some of the same issues, but I see them maybe a little differently in that I think that we don't know, it's a little unclear. Yes, religious service attendance is down, but we do know that people help construct religious communities through social media. And I feel a little less demoralized about that possibility. Like, I feel like you actually can construct communities through media that are different and that have different strengths and weaknesses, but they have the advantage of allowing people, for example, who might see themselves as religiously unaffiliated and to be, not that I have any experience of this, to be the only religiously liberal person in a small town or something, and then suddenly be able to, thanks to social media, find all sorts of other people who might share your interests, share your values, to tell you that, I mean, this is the, I don't know if you remember the It Gets Better campaign for queer youth, where a bunch of media personalities went online and did a series of ads that said, it gets better, just survive high school and get out and you'll meet other people and you won't have to commit suicide or otherwise struggle in the ways that so many people do in high school when they're isolated. And so I think that this is an option that we don't know quite where it's going to go, but is clearly serving as an alternative to some more traditional religious and secular organizations. So that we see also, you know, there's not so much in the way of Rotary clubs. Unions are in decline. Volunteer organizations suffer, and there are all sorts of problems with that. But we do also see the possibility of finding people who are scattered, who might not otherwise find each other, and constructing communities that might otherwise not be able to exist. And so, for example, same thing with young Muslims in small towns who might, you know, they might have families who immigrated and who came to a small town to work in a medical profession or do some other kind of work in a small town where there aren't very many other Muslims or Hindus or other groups, and they might be able to then find other people who share their faith or who share their values or share their culture through social media. So I think we're in a very different world, but I don't think we know yet what kind of affiliations might ultimately come out of this that might be something other than like Mean Girls on Twitter.
Or Star Trek, where you just really can't figure out what anyone is, or do they have any sort of, sorry for that.
I thought you were talking about Star Trek religion, which is also a thing.
Well, I've always just watched Star Trek, and I wondered, like, all notion of religion is sort of gone, and sometimes when I hear these types of discussions, I wonder, is that where we're headed? Like, if any of this sort of organizing, if it's on the wane in general, are we moving toward this society where, I don't know what it looks like, to your point. Are we just finding new ways to organize, or is it eroding?
Yeah. And I will say one thing, I wanted to say this a little earlier, but I'll just mention it briefly, is that also people are not so neat in their religious beliefs either. So you might consider yourself a Methodist or a Jew, or you might consider yourself a Hindu, or you might consider yourself a nun, but a lot of people combine pieces of this in very innovative and interesting ways. And so that even when we talk about religious communities, and we sort of talk about them as if all the people in them share a theology or a set of values, but actually often it's a bit mushier than that. So you know, if you ask a Southerner a question, they answer with a story. So I will answer this partly with a story about my small town where I grew up, where a lot of high school friends that I had in high school are evangelical, white evangelical Christians. And I'm in touch with them, of course, through Facebook. And they are very serious Baptist and Methodist and whatever churches they go to. They consider themselves quite religious, but they also have an organization that I have a t-shirt that's, I grew up near the Uwharrie Mountains, and it's called the Uwharrie Mountain Paranormal Society, THUMPS. And they are ghost hunters, too. And they go and they look for ghosts, you know, in the Uwharrie Mountains and, you know, video it and, you know, talk to each other about the ghost. And I don't want to say, like, I'm pretty sure this is unorthodox theology, guys. Like, I'm pretty sure you shouldn't talk to your pastor about this because this is, but that kind of syncretism, that kind of mixing of a little crystals here, a little Christianity here, a little yoga there, is something very common. And so even our religious communities, I think, are becoming, and have been for some time, much more a mix of different kinds of practices and beliefs.
Yeah, just a quick thing to say about this too is that it's also context. So I often tell people, you know, some people who consider themselves progressive Christians might in some context, if someone says, are you a Christian, they want to know what that other person means by that. Because they might say, I'm a Christian by my definition, but if you mean, am I a born again or a Trump supporter or whatever, no. And so, there's also the sense of how are other people using these categories, and my sense of identity might actually shift in some of these different contexts. Okay.
Another question?
You've touched on it a lot about the mushiness of religion, and you started out, I think, talking about how a politician's going to make a connection with a religious group. Given that, what would be the chances for a devout atheist or someone who said, my religious bona fides are none of your damn business in a major political campaign?
That question kind of got answered in 2016 because Bernie Sanders did so well. And I think, and he was someone who absolutely, refused to talk about religion and is, quite secular by all measures. Now, where did he do well? He did well with the left. It might remain to be seen, although actually, given Donald Trump's own very tenuous relationship to Christianity, I think that also shows us that maybe some of that sense that a person has to be a Christian might be a little fungible, or as long as they are going to take the right positions on abortion and other things, we don't care about their sex life anymore, or whatever, we don't care about ethics. So we might be closer than we think. I mean, several years ago, I think most of the sort of religion folks would have said, there's no way, you have to at least pretend to believe in God if you want to get very far. It's interesting now. I do think the landscape has somewhat shifted, and there is more, I don't just even mean toleration, but, kind of, an acceptance of a sense that maybe atheists aren't inevitably bad people. They might actually share some values with other folks. I think it's probably still a very delicate balance how one walks that path, but, it feels to me like we're a lot closer than I would have guessed. Given both Sanders and Trump.
Yeah, you can cite 2 Corinthians today and get
2
by with
Corinthians,
it.
yeah.
And it'll be perfectly acceptable.
Hi, I'm a third year in the politics department, and I'm taking a religion, violence, and strategy course at Jerry White this semester. So with talking about how religion can be so divisive in America, kind of with a global view, we're kind of exploring how religious leaders and then possibly members of religions can intervene through forms of protests guided by their faith to resolve political conflict. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a great question, and I'm torn about it because I want to say that sometimes it's disturbing to me the idea that religious leaders are particularly empowered to intervene in global conflict when maybe everybody should be trying to speak out about justice in the best and most complex ways they can. Especially if, as in the case that I write about in my book, for example, in Sudan, when American evangelicals really believed that they were speaking out on behalf of Sudanese Christians in the South, and they were, but that meant that they helped to shape and understand a conflict that was much more complicated. They understood it and framed it in the U.S. as a Muslim-Christian conflict. And so they intervened. They played a major role in helping get the U.S. on the side of South Sudan and in the formation of South Sudan as a country. And this included black and white American evangelicals who were deeply involved, and many of whom are extraordinary people. I went to South Sudan with a group of people who cared deeply about what was going on there. I'm not trying to be dismissive at all. But I will say that then when Sudan was formed as a country and then devolved into a terribly vicious civil war within South Sudan, American Christians were nowhere to be found because there was no nothing that activated them because it wasn't a Muslim-Christian conflict and religion wasn't really a factor, and so people stopped sort of paying attention. So I'm a little torn about that and when I speak about it, but I will say that you can see examples of people who use their religious faith to great advantage to talk about political issues, and I'll just give one example. So 20 years ago, when you said American evangelical in Israel, that just meant one thing. American evangelicals were deeply supportive and remain, by and large, deeply supportive of Israel, including the most conservative positions. I mean, many American Jews are far to the left of American evangelicals around Israel. But in the last decade or so, there have been a group of American evangelicals who are liberal, politically liberal, more or less, but they have been holding conferences with evangelicals in the West Bank to talk about like and they're trying to say, you know, they totally support Israel as a state, but they're trying to see Palestinian perspectives and to hear more about Palestinian perspectives. And you know, that's been going on every other year, and it has people from around the world, but a lot of people from the US, Shane Claiborne and some of the other kind of left-wing evangelicals. And the most amazing thing to me about this conference is its title. It's called Christ at the Checkpoint. So that's an example of kind of using religion and using the symbols of religion to make a political point.
Back in the civil rights era, and really continuing on today, many in the traditional church criticized African American pastors because they were very public with their political views, based on their values, of course, and supported particular candidates. And many in the mainline churches called for their tax-exempt status to be taken away. Now today, you see that in the more evangelical, especially the more conservative Christian congregations, with pastors coming out very publicly, politically, and supporting particular candidates. Would you like to comment on that?
I mean, you know, Melanie earlier said that, you know, that religious, I forget how you said, religious or evangelical commitment to religious liberty has been intermittent. And I would say, you know, human beings are opportunistic, as it turns out. And so, you know, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, that Christian leaders, evangelicals, whatever category you want to talk about, have condemned political activism where they didn't like the politics and supported the activism where they did. And you might be able to say the same on the other side as well. But it's certainly the side, I think, on the conservative side. And so you're absolutely right. And, you know, there's all of these fears now about what's going to happen to the Johnson Amendment and to, you know, the kind of curbs and restrictions we've had on actually being able to endorse candidates from the pulpit. And, you know, I do think, on the one hand, I do think those things are very worrisome. On the other hand, I think we've got to be realistic and say if we think people haven't been endorsing candidates from the pulpit, then, you know, somebody's going to sell us a bridge to somewhere, you know. Mm-hmm. So, you know, this stuff has been happening a long time. On the other hand, do we want to open the floodgates and say it's fine and now you can do it more openly? Probably not. So I don't want to see things move in that direction. But, you know, it's just, you know, again, this is where it gets to the crux of the issue that you've brought us here to discuss. Religion and politics, where do you separate them, right? You know, of course, if a person has a deep religious conviction about an issue, they're going to, you know, vote that way and not just see it as political. That's going to be seen as a part of their faith. And that's what is really so complex about this, is just how deeply interrelated a person's religious and political views are, and how different it looks from the outside, but how it could feel to me, you know, personally. So I think you've pointed at a very important contradiction or hypocrisy or opportunistic kind of shift. But you know, it does just go to the heart of these issues, I think, around religion and politics.
I think we've got time for one more.
Thank you for a very thoughtful discussion. I remember 50 years ago, religious fervor was all about social justice, civil rights, anti-war, and now it seems to be have shifted into, like what you say, anti-abortion and more like individual beliefs. So when and why did that shift take place?
We'll spoke to it. Okay. Right. So, first of all, I want to say the religious left is alive and well, and so the fervor for social justice in some congregations, I'm sure some of you know, is very present. I happened to go to the first Women's March in 2017, and I was struck by how many visible signs of religious affiliation there were. You know, yarmulkes and hijabs, but also, you know, Christian ministers holding up their United Church of Christ signs and the Sojourners people over there. And, you know, and it reminded me that, you know, I don't know that the media has always been good at capturing that, but it exists. People aren't always regular churchgoers in those communities, and so when we measure church attendance, I think we miss some of that, you know, sort of energy. So there is that energy still there, and I actually think it was galvanized in some ways by Trump's election. But to go back to your historical point, you know, I think the answer really does lie in the 1970s and the rise of figures like Anita Bryant, Phyllis Schlafly, and Jerry Falwell. And those three were they were brilliant. I mean, they were brilliant at stoking fear of that social justice, of presenting social justice as a secularizing, liberalizing, terrible force, and pulling Christians from, sometimes from the left, but certainly from the center, into the far right. And that, you know, that's a process. We don't have time to go into it all. As I've said several times tonight, a lot of the energy was around gender and sexuality issues. I see those as absolutely core. Racial issues and you know, fear of racial equality and integration was also a part of it, and other issues too. But, you know, so really by the mid-'80s, you know, the kind of Reagan years, you've got a very powerful political religious right and tremendous energy and money, you know, that went into that.
Yeah, it's such an important question, and Maria and I sort of joke about she's going to always give the domestic answer, and I'm always going to give the international one, but we both believe in both of them. So I would say that what she has just said is completely true, and in addition, and I'm going to just speak about evangelicals now for a minute, there was a moment in the late 60s and 1970s when it seemed like American evangelicalism actually might become a somewhat liberal to actually liberal movement. So in 1970, a guy named Samuel Escobar, who's a Latin American liberation theology kind of guy, although he's an evangelical, comes and speaks at the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship Conference, and he tells the students, you guys need to be reading Marx and Marcuse. You know, they know more about social injustice than most of our pastors do. Now, they don't understand about sin, and we understand about sin, so they don't know everything, but you need to be reading Marx and Marcuse. Now, I don't know about you all, but I didn't expect that at an evangelical conference, and it was not unique. It was happening in all sorts of places, that especially coming from Latin America, but also coming from parts of South Africa, the liberal part of South Africa, black South Africans and some liberal whites from other parts of Asia. People were pushing for a more social justice agenda. And at the 1974 Lausanne Conference, they come out of that conference thinking they have won. They think, we have pushed American evangelicals to understand that this is not about just counting converts. This is not about American materialism. Evangelicals need to be thinking about social issues, racism, global poverty, oppression. You know, they think they've won. And Francis Schaeffer, who is one of the important Americans at that conference, seems to be on board with that. And then Francis Schaeffer comes back to the US and becomes basically the philosopher of the moral majority, and he makes the big movie, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that's one of the big first anti-abortion movies that helps to organize American evangelicals around abortion. And he does so in the language of social concern. If we care about the oppressed, we need to care about these oppressed who are still in the womb. If we care about materialism, we need to think about how women are so materialistic they only care about themselves and not about these unborn babies. He uses all of the language of social concern and turns it to this other issue. And I interviewed Ron Sider, who's the author of a book called Rich Christians in an Age of Poverty, and one of the leaders of the evangelical left. And he said, yeah, you know, we went to Lausanne, we talked social concern, and the people who heard us were the religious right. And they came back and stopped focusing just on converting convicts and converts, stopped focusing just on talking about Jesus, started talking about politics. They just had a really different politics.
Melani McAlister and Marie Griffith, thank you very much for being with us.